Hello, I'm Shehryar.
And I'm Jason Vargas, and today we'll talk about the Vietnam and Afghan wars. The Vietnam War occurred between the Communist North Vietnam and South Vietnam, which sided with the United States. It lasted from 1954 through 1975. The roots of the war began in the many years leading up to 1954. North Vietnam created a communist government based entirely on China and the Soviet Union. South Korea, on the other hand, wanted to preserve traditional Vietnam culture and had close ties to the West. The United States and the Soviet Union both started pouring troops in South and North Vietnam, respectively. The actual conflict arose after the government of North Vietnam overthrew the French colonial administration in 1954 and wanted to unite all of Vietnam under a communist regime. The supporters of the North Vietnamese government in South Vietnam were called the Viet Cong. Finally, in 1973, the U.S. finally withdrew its troops from Vietnam, accepting loss. The Vietnam government remained divided until 1995, when they continued democratic elections according to Encyclopedia Britannica. Over 2 million civilians died on both sides and about 1.1 million soldiers died in the Vietnam War.
Hello, I'm Shehryar and I'll be talking about the Afghan War. The Afghan War started in 1978 through 1992. It was a war between anti-communist Muslim group called Mujahideen, meaning those who engage in jihad, and the supporters of communism who were aided by the Soviet Union. The war started with the overthrowing of Muhammad Daud Khan by a military officer, Nur Muhammad Karaki. This resulted in the fragmentation of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan into the People's Party and the Barriers Party. This picture right here is a symbol of the People's Party of Afghanistan. Although these two parties reemerged as one, they still created internal disputes within the government. The new government created close ties with the Soviet Union. In addition, this government was extremely repressive and they enacted many social and land reforms which weren't liked by the majority population. An anti-communist group of Muslims rose against the government and began rebelling violently. At first, the Soviet Union put the problems in the hands of the Afghan military, but soon the problem grew out of the Afghan government's power and the Soviet Union had to step in. The Soviets tried to bomb many civilian places where the Mujahideen resided. Unfortunately, this led to many casualties and many Afghanistan citizens were displaced. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, 2.8 million Afghans fled to Pakistan and an additional 1.5 million to Iran. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was already in decline and the war made things worse for the nation. In 1988, the Soviet Union, the United States, Pakistan, and Afghanistan signed an agreement in which the Soviet Union withdrew its troops from Afghanistan. By the end of the war, over 1.5 million Afghans were killed and over 6 million were displaced.
Now we'll talk about the similarities. There are many similarities between the two wars. To start, almost 80% of the populations in both countries were rural, and literacy was at 10%. In addition, both wars had a side that used guerrilla warfare, and in both places, guerrilla warfare defeated and overcame the European powers. This is the most important similarity because it showed that the superpowers were able to be defeated. Both wars lasted about a decade long, and unfortunately, innocent people are killed for political reasons in both wars. Both wars were extremely expensive, with costs exceeding $1 trillion. According to the Living History Fund, the Vietnam War cost $1 trillion, and according to the Time, the Afghanistan War cost between $4 through $6 trillion. After both wars took place, a civil war came into action. The U.S. had no direct reason for getting into any of these wars. In the Afghan War, the U.S. helped the Mujahideen in order to combat the spread of communism. The U.S. helped the South Vietnam in the Vietnam War in order to support democracy in Asia. In both cases, they only intervened to promote its economic policy in the midst of the Cold War.
Although there were many similarities among these two wars, there were also many differences. For example, Vietnam was a united country while Afghanistan wasn't. There were a lot more soldiers deployed in Vietnam than there were in Afghanistan. Furthermore, more soldiers meant more deaths occurred in the Vietnam War. Another major difference between the wars is who was fighting. In the Afghanistan War, it was civilians versus the communist government. In Vietnam, on the other hand, it was a communist government against a non-communist government. According to townhall.com, the last difference lay in the experience of the two sides fighting. In the Vietnam War, the U.S. fought against an army with over 30 years of experience, while in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union fought a loosely tied force of anti-communist citizens. Another important difference that occurred between the Vietnam War and the Afghan War was the use of biological warfare. In the Vietnam War, the USA used chemical weapons in order to destroy the natural vegetation in order to see the Vietnamese soldiers. In Afghanistan, however, there was no use of any chemical warfare. So this highlights a very important similarity because in Vietnam, it was the first instance in which a country used chemical warfare in combat. Thank you. This is Shehryar and
Jason Vargas.